My name is Hosanna Calloway, and on the 14th of February in the year 1888, I stepped down from the rail car at a place called Cold Branch in the Montana Territory with one trunk, one shawl, and one folded letter from a man I had never laid eyes on. The wind that met me on the platform was not the wind I had been raised to. It was a wind that did not blow so much as press, the way a cold hand presses against a window when it wants to come inside. The sky behind the depot was the color of old pewter, and the snow that had begun to fall was already small and hard and serious, the kind of snow that means business with the country it falls upon. I was 18 years old that winter, and I had ridden 8 days from the small town in Ohio where I had grown up keeping house for my widowed aunt. My aunt had not been cruel to me, but she had not been kind either, and when she had passed in the autumn, the cousins who inherited her cottage had been polite about how soon I might find my own way. I had answered an advertisement in a paper that came up from St. Louis. The advertisement had spoken of a man of property in the Montana Territory who sought a wife of steady character, and the letters that came back to me had been brief but neat, and I had told myself that brief and neat were good signs in a man who lived a hard country alone. I had told myself a great many things on the train. I had told myself that loneliness in a strange place could not be worse than loneliness in a familiar one. I had told myself that a woman of 18 with no living parents and no inheritance has fewer doors than a woman of 20 with either. I had told myself that the Lord did not bring a soul this far west to be undone, and that whatever waited for me at the end of the line would be a beginning, even if it was a poor one. The train had clicked along under those thoughts for 8 days, and the thoughts had grown smoother, the way a stone in a creek grows smoother, until I almost believed them. The platform at Cold Branch was a single board structure with a bench bolted to the wall and a kerosene lantern swinging on a hook. There was no station house worth the name. There was a man in a black coat standing under the eave with his hands in his pockets, and when I stepped down, he did not move forward to meet me. He looked me over once, from the brim of my bonnet to the hem of my traveling dress, and then he looked at the trunk the porter set down beside me, and then he looked at my hands, which were ungloved because my gloves had a hole in the thumb I had not yet mended. He did not smile. He nodded once, the way a man nods at a horse he has bought sight unseen and is not yet sure he wants to keep. His name was Bartholomew Pickett, and he was 36 years old that day, and he was the man whose letters had brought me west. He was tall but thin in the shoulders, with a narrow face and a mustache that had been trimmed too sharp at the corners, and the cuffs of his black coat were rubbed shiny in a way that told me without a word that the property his advertisement had mentioned was a smaller property than the advertisement had implied. He took the handle of my trunk in one hand. He did not take my arm. He said only, "Reverend Pendleton is waiting at the church. Storm is coming in. We had best move." I had imagined many words on the train, and I had imagined many silences, but I had not imagined this particular silence, which was the silence of a man who has already begun to count his losses before the deal has even closed. I followed him across the platform with my shawl pulled up over my hair, and the snow stung my cheeks, and I felt for the first time the small, cold understanding that the country into which I had stepped was not going to ask me what I had hoped for. It was simply going to deliver what it delivered, and I was going to have to stand to it, the way one stands to weather, with whatever spine the Lord had given me. The church at Cold Branch was a one-room building of unpainted plank, with a stovepipe leaning out the side wall and a cross of 2 nailed boards above the door. Reverend Solomon Pendleton met us inside. He was 62 years old, a circuit preacher who covered 4 settlements on horseback in all weathers, and he had a long white beard and eyes that had seen a great deal and judged little of it aloud. He took my cold hand in both of his when I entered, and he held it for the length of 2 slow breaths, and in those 2 breaths he said more to me with his eyes than my new husband had said with his mouth. He said, "I see you, child." He said, "I am sorry for what I see." He said, "I will stand witness to this anyway, because that is my office." The ceremony took perhaps 5 minutes. There were 2 witnesses, a woman from the depot and the stove tender from the freight office, and they stood at the back wall with their hats in their hands and did not say a word. Reverend Pendleton spoke the vows in a voice that was gentle to me and level to Bartholomew, and Bartholomew answered, "I do," in a voice that was already counting the cost of the trip back to wherever we were going. I answered, "I do," in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, because I had decided somewhere on the train that whatever came of this, I would not be the one who came apart at the altar. I would come apart later, in private, if I came apart at all. The Reverend laid his palm flat on the open Bible and pronounced us man and wife. And the wind outside hit the church wall hard enough that the cross above the door shook on its nail. Reverend Pendleton walked me to the door himself when it was over. He pressed a small folded paper into my hand at the threshold, and he closed my fingers over it, and he said quietly, "Daughter, if you have need of me, the church is here, and the parsonage door is never bolted. The Lord knows where to find me, and so do you." I did not know then what was in the paper, and I did not look. I tucked it into the inner pocket of my dress against my ribs, where my mother's wedding ring had hung on a chain when I was a girl. I thanked him. I stepped out into the snow on the arm of my new husband, and the wind took the edge of my shawl and tried hard to take it all together. The buckboard waiting for us in the lane was a thin one. The bed was scarcely longer than my trunk, and the boards were warped with weather, and the horse in the traces was a sway-backed brown gelding, who looked at me out of one tired eye and seemed to ask, on its own behalf, whether I had thought this through. Bartholomew swung my trunk into the bed with a grunt that suggested he had hoped it would be heavier. He climbed up onto the seat. He did not offer me his hand. I gathered my skirt and my shawl, and I climbed up beside him on my own, and the seat was so narrow that my shoulder touched his coat, and he moved away from the touch as if it had been an imposition. He clucked to the gelding, and the buckboard began to move, and the snow began to fall in earnest, and the little town of Cold Branch slid past us in the gathering dusk like a row of small lit lanterns set in deepening water. There was a general store on the right with a yellow window and a sign that said, "Eldora Sweet Dry Goods" in fading paint, and a woman of about 50 stood behind the glass watching us pass. She lifted her hand to me when our eyes met. I lifted mine back, just once, before the buildings ended and the prairie opened, and the road north out of town became a thin, pale ribbon between dark stands of pine. For the first hour, Bartholomew did not speak at all. The horse picked its way through snow that had been 6 inches deep at the depot and was now 10 inches at the edge of town, and was rising toward the gelding's hocks by the time we crossed the second creek. The runners of the buckboard slid in and out of the ruts of an older sleigh track, and the wind came at us across the open ground in long, sweeping gusts that drove the snow sideways. I pulled my shawl up over my bonnet and tucked my chin into my collar, and I held the edge of the seat with one ungloved hand, and I tried to take the measure of the man I had married. He was the kind of man I thought, who had decided long before he met me what he was going to think of me, and who was now resentful that the woman in the seat beside him did not match the woman he had decided to think of. I had written him plain letters. I had not promised him anything I did not have. I had said I was orphaned, and that I had kept a house, and that I was strong of constitution and willing of heart, and I had said nothing about money, because I had no money to speak of, save the $11 in coin sewn into the lining of my trunk and the small tin locket of my mother's that I would not have parted with for any price the world could name. I had thought in my plainness that I was being honest. I had not thought that the man on the other end of the letters might be reading my plainness and hoping it concealed something else. We crossed a third creek, and Bartholomew at last spoke, and what he said was, "Your aunt, did she leave you anything?" He did not ask it as a question. He stated it as a charge that needed answering. I was quiet a moment because I had not expected that to be the first sentence from my husband on the day of our wedding, and then I said, "She left me her blessing, Mr. Pickett. The cottage went to her sons. There was no estate beyond what was hers to use in life." He did not look at me. He shook his head once, slowly, the way a man shakes his head over a hand of cards that has not gone the way he planned. He said, "I had thought there might be a portion." I said, "I am sorry, Mr. Pickett, if you misunderstood my letters. I tried to be plain." He said nothing more for a long while. The snow grew heavier. The light, which had been the color of pewter at the depot, slid toward the color of slate, and then toward the color of iron, and then toward the color of nothing at all. The road, which had of nothing at all, the road, which had been thin and pale, became no road, only a memory of a road under a smooth white surface. The horse's breath came out in long white plumes and froze in tiny crystals on the hairs of his muzzle, and his ears, which had been flicking forward and back at the start of the journey, settled into a low backward set that I knew, even from the limited horse sense of an Ohio girl, meant the animal was suffering. I watched the back of Bartholomew's neck above his black collar, and I tried to think of something a wife might say to her husband on her wedding evening that would soften the lines I could see hardening there. I could not think of a single thing. Somewhere past the 5th-mile marker, the snow rose to the gelding's knees, and the buckboard began to drag rather than roll. Bartholomew swore under his breath. He climbed down once and led the horse forward by the bridle for perhaps a quarter mile, and then he climbed back up and slapped the lines, and then he climbed down again. I sat on the bench through these descents with my hands folded in my lap and the snow piling on my shoulders like a second shawl, and I watched my husband become, with each climb, less a man going home and more a man calculating a loss. I had seen men calculate losses before. I had not, until that hour, understood that I might be one of them. It was somewhere near the 6th-mile marker that he stopped the wagon for the last time. He did not climb down. He sat with the lines slack across his knees and stared at the pale ground in front of the gelding's chest, and the wind made a thin moaning sound in the pines on the right side of the road, and the snow came down and down and down. When he spoke at last, he did not turn his face toward me. He spoke into the dark ahead, as if he were rehearsing words for a smaller audience than he had. He said, "I made a mistake. I cannot afford to keep you. I cannot feed two on what I have, and I will not feed two on what I have." He said it flatly, the way a man reads off a list of goods he is not buying. I do not remember in what order the words came after that. I remember that he climbed down and went to the back of the buckboard and put both hands on my trunk and tipped it off into the snow. I remember the small, dull thud the trunk made when it landed, and the way the lid sprang half open and the corner of my second-best dress showed pale against the white, and the way the wind took the corner of the dress and lifted it and dropped it. I remember that he climbed back up onto the seat, and that he turned the gelding in the road, and that the gelding, who I think understood the turning better than I did, hesitated for one full breath before he obeyed. I remember that Bartholomew Pickett, my husband of perhaps 2 hours, did not look at me as he passed me on the seat. He looked at the road back toward Cold Branch, and the buckboard slid past me in the snow, and I stood on the white verge of the track in my cotton and wool traveling dress with one hand on my trunk and watched the small, dark shape of him grow smaller against the dark. I want to tell you that I screamed after him. I did not. I want to tell you that I shook my fist at the sky. I did not. I stood very still with my ungloved hand on the lid of my trunk, and I felt the cold come up through the soles of my boots, and I listened to the wind say what the wind says when there is no shelter near. The buckboard disappeared, first into the snow and then into the dusk, and the sound of the runners went last. A thin hissing slide that thinned and was gone, and there was only the wind and the pines on the right side of the road, and a girl from Ohio with a tin locket and $11 sewn into her trunk, and no one in any direction who knew her name. I did not cry then either. I have wondered since whether I should have, whether tears might have warmed my face. But I think the truth is that the part of me that knew how to cry had stayed back at the church door with Reverend Pendleton's hand pressed over mine. What stood in the snow on the road north of Cold Branch was a smaller, harder part of me that I had not met before. That part of me opened the trunk. That part of me lifted out the heavy wool blanket my aunt had pieced for me when I was 12. That part of me wrapped the blanket twice around my shoulders, over the shawl, and pinned it shut at the throat with the brass pin from my dress, and looked north up the road, where the buckboard had been heading before my husband changed his mind, and decided that a girl could either die beside a trunk or walk. I walked. I did not know how far it was to anywhere. I did not know whether the next house lay at mile 7 or mile 14 or 20. I knew only that standing was death and that walking was at least motion, and motion was what my body had to offer the night. I left the trunk where it lay. I put one hand on the brass pin at my throat and one hand on the small folded paper Reverend Pendleton had pressed against my ribs, and I started up the road in the snow that had risen now past my ankles and was rising still. The first hour of walking was the hour in which I made the bargains. I bargained with my feet, which were already losing feeling in the toes, that if they would carry me to the next bend in the road, I would let them rest. I bargained with my hands, which I kept tucked under the blanket against my ribs, that if they would stay warm, I would mend the gloves the moment I reached anything that resembled a hearth. I bargained with my breath, which had begun to hurt going in, that if it would keep coming, I would never again take a warm room for granted as long as the Lord let me live. I bargained, last of all, with the road itself, that if it would only show me a light, I would not ask for any other miracle that night. The second hour of walking was the hour in which the bargain stopped. The wind had risen, and the snow had risen with it, and the road had become only a slightly paler stripe between slightly darker pines, and my legs above the knees had begun to feel, oddly, warm, which I knew enough to know was not warmth at all, but the body's last lie to itself before the cold takes the lie away. I prayed, if you can call it prayer, in fragments, the way a child prays when she has forgotten the order of the words. I said, Lord. I said, please. I said, my mother. I said, anybody. I said, anybody at all. The wind took the words off my lips before they were even fully shaped and carried them up over the pines and did with them whatever the wind does with words like that. I do not know at what point my walking became a stagger. I know that I came to a place where the road bent left around a stand of tall pines, and that there was a single great pine at the bend with a low fork in its trunk, and that I had it in my mind that I would sit only for a moment in the fork of that pine to catch my breath before I went on. I know that I sat. I know that my eyes closed once, and that I made them open, and that they closed again, and that the second closing was longer and quieter than the first. I know that the wind seemed suddenly far away, the way the world seems far away when a fever lifts you out of a bed. I know that I thought of my mother's face, which I had not been able to see clearly for years, and that for one strange, peaceful moment I could see it perfectly, every line of it, and she was not afraid for me. I did not see Bow Whitestock when he found me. I felt him. I felt a heavy, warm weight settle around my shoulders, a weight that smelled of pine pitch and wood smoke and the deep, musky animal smell of bear. And I felt two arms slide under me, one behind my knees and one behind my back, and I felt myself lifted out of the fork of the pine as easily as a child is lifted out of a chair. There was a voice in the warmth above my head, a low, calm voice that did not hurry and did not raise itself, and the voice said, "Ma'am, you stay with me now. You stay awake, ma'am." I tried to answer. I could not find my mouth to answer. The voice said, all right, I have you. You stay with me." I did not know who he was. I did not know that he was 39 years old, or that his name was Bowdoin, and that the men who knew him called him Bow, or that he had ridden out that afternoon to check the last of his trap line before the storm closed it, or that he had taken the long cut down the south side of the ridge instead of the north because his stocky bay mare had thrown a stone earlier in the day and he wanted the easier descent. I did not know that the great fur cloak now wrapped around me was a black bear hide he had cured himself the previous winter, or that the man whose chest I was now leaning against had been a widower for 6 years and a guardian to a small boy for 2, or that he was, by every account in 3 counties, the quietest man on Whitestock Ridge. I knew only that I was warm and that the warmth had a heartbeat, and that the heartbeat was not in any hurry. He set me on the saddle of the bay mare with my body tipped forward over her withers and my cheek against her warm neck, and he steadied me there with one large hand flat against my back, and he spoke softly to the mare in a way I could not make out, and the mare blew once through her nostrils and stood. He did not mount behind me. He took the bridle in his free hand and stepped forward into the snow on his own boots, and I understood, in the dim way that one understands things at the edge of consciousness, that he had decided the mare could not carry both of us in this snow, and that he would walk. He clucked once to her, and she stepped, and we began to move up the road in the direction my husband had not been willing to go. I do not remember most of those 9 miles. I remember pieces of them, the way one remembers pieces of a long fever dream. I remember the slow, steady rhythm of the mare's shoulders under my cheek. I remember the squeak of his boots in the snow, a regular small sound that did not falter. I remember that once, when my body began to slide sideways out of the saddle, his hand came up and pressed me back into place. And the press was firm but careful, the way a man rights a stack of dry wood that has begun to lean. I remember that once when I made some small sound that might have been a word and might have been only a breath, he said again, "Stay awake, ma'am, just a while yet. Stay awake." I remember that the wind, which had been so loud on the road below, grew softer as we climbed, because the cut he was leading the mare up was sheltered on both sides by old timber, and the snow that fell into the cut fell more straight and less driven. I remember that at one place the cut narrowed and the mare hesitated, and that he stepped close to her shoulder and laid his forehead briefly against her neck and said something I could not hear, and that she went on. I remember that I thought, in the haze of it all, that whatever this man was, he was a man who knew how to ask a horse for what the horse could give, and not for more, and that I had not been sure before that night that such men existed. I remember the smell of wood smoke before I remember the cabin. The smell came down through the trees ahead of us, thin and resinous and unmistakable. The smell of seasoned pine burning in a chimney that had been built and tended by a man who knew his fire. I remember that the smell made my eyes water, though my eyes had been dry for an hour, and that the watering surprised me because I had not known I had any water left. I remember that the mare lifted her head when the smell reached her and quickened her step half a pace, and that the man at her bridle said gently, "Easy, girl, easy, almost home." The cabin stood on a small bench cut into the south flank of the ridge, with a low stone hearth chimney at its north end and a single window of real glass on its east wall. I saw it in pieces from the angle of my cheek against the mare's neck, the door first, then the window with its yellow lamplight, then the woodpile under the eave, neatly stacked, the way a man stacks wood when he intends to live somewhere. The door opened before we reached it, and a small figure stood in the rectangle of light, a boy of perhaps 10 years, with a thatch of brown hair and eyes that went very wide when they took in the shape draped over the saddle. The boy did not cry out. He stepped aside from the door and held it open against the wind, and the man at the bridle led the mare up to the very threshold and then lifted me down out of the saddle the way he had lifted me out of the pine and carried me through the door into a room that smelled of pine smoke and stew and wet wool. And the boy closed the door behind us against the storm. I remember the suddenness of the warmth. I remember the way the firelight ran red along the inside of my eyelids when I closed them. I remember a low voice saying to the boy, "Asher, the bed, pull the quilts back." I remember small, quick footsteps and the sound of quilts moving, and then I remember being laid down on a bed that smelled of cedar shavings, and a heavy weight of wool being laid over me, and the low voice saying again, "Stay awake, ma'am, just a little longer, help is coming." The next thing I knew clearly was a woman's hand on my forehead, cool and dry and steady, and a woman's voice above me saying, "Hush now, child, hush, you are safe in this house, you are safe under this roof, drink." A spoon touched my lower lip, and broth came into my mouth, and the broth was hot and salty and tasted of marrow, and I swallowed without meaning to, and the swallowing hurt and helped at once. I opened my eyes a little. There was a woman bent over me with iron gray hair, pulled back severely from a strong, weathered face, and brown eyes that were neither soft nor hard, but only present, the way a good neighbor's eyes are present. "I am Caraway Holcomb," she said. "Mrs. Holcomb, off the next ridge. Bow rode down for me before dawn. You have been out 3 days and a night, child, and the fever has been hard on you. But it is broken now. Drink another spoonful for me." I drank again. I tried to ask where I was, and what day it was, and whether the man who had carried me was real, and whether I had only dreamed the smell of bear fur and pine pitch, and Mrs. Caraway Holcomb, who had nursed half the women of 2 ridges through fevers and births and griefs, only smoothed the hair back from my forehead and said, "Time for questions later, child. Time for broth now." I drank. I closed my eyes. When I opened them next, the firelight had moved across the room, and there was a man sitting on a low wooden stool by the hearth with his elbows on his knees and his big hands hanging loose between them, and he was watching the fire, and not me, and I understood, even before I had heard his voice in the daylight, that this was the man who had walked 9 miles beside a horse for a woman whose name he did not know. He saw that I was awake. He did not stand. He nodded once, the way a man nods to a neighbor across a fence, and he said in the same low voice that had told me to stay awake, "Ma'am, you are at my place, on Whitestock Ridge. The fever has gone down. Mrs. Holcomb says you are mending. There is broth on the hob when you can take more." That was all he said. He did not ask me my name. He did not ask me whose I was. He did not ask me how I had come to be sitting in the fork of a pine in a blizzard at the 6th mile marker north of Cold Branch. He let me lie where I lay, and he watched the fire, and I understood that he was a man who had decided that questions could wait until a body had stopped shaking. I said, after a while, "My name is Hosanna Calloway." I said it because I had not said it aloud since the church, and because I needed to hear it said in this room before anything else happened in this room. He turned his head then, slowly, and looked at me across the firelight, and his eyes were gray under heavy, dark brows, and they were the kind of eyes that did not flinch and did not narrow, and after a moment he said, "Mrs. Pickett, then." I shook my head against the pillow. The shaking hurt. "Hosanna," I said. "The other name does not fit any more." He looked at me a long, quiet moment. He did not nod, and he did not argue. He only said, "Hosanna," once, the way a man tries a word in his mouth to see if it will hold weight, and then he turned his face back to the fire. The boy at the table looked up from his slate and looked at me with his wide brown eyes, and then he looked at his uncle, and then he looked back at the slate, and a small, careful smile moved across his mouth and was gone again. I learned the shape of that house in pieces over the following days, the way one learns the shape of a room in the dark by reaching out and touching things. The cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft above, reached by a ladder of pegged rungs in the north wall. The bed I lay in was the only true bed in the cabin, and it stood in the south corner under the window. The hearth was on the north wall, and there was a long plank table set under the east window where the boy did his sums, and there was a settle bench by the fire with a folded gray blanket on it. And I understood by the second day that the folded gray blanket was where Bow Whitestock had been sleeping since I had been laid down in his bed. I tried, on the morning of the 4th day, to rise from the bed and tell him I would take the settle and let him have his own place back. My legs would not bear me. Mrs. Caraway, who had stayed in the cabin those 4 days, and slept in a chair by the fire with her shawl pulled up to her chin, caught me by the elbow before I had got my feet to the floor and pressed me back. "Child," she said, "you have nothing to prove in this house. The man knows what he is about. He has slept harder places than that bench, and he has slept easier ones. Lie down, drink, mend. There is time. She said it the way a woman says a thing she has said often enough to herself that she trusts it. The boy was Asher Whitestock. He was Bow's sister's son, and his sister had died of childbirth fever 2 years before, and the boy's father, who had been a freighter on the Bozeman Road, had not survived a wagon turnover the same summer. Asher had come to live with his uncle at 4 years old, and now, at 10, he was a wiry, watchful child with brown eyes too old for his face and a small, careful smile that he gave only to people he had decided to trust. He decided to trust me on the second morning, when I asked him to bring me his slate and let me see his letters, and he sat on the edge of the bed and showed me his copywork, and I corrected the tail of his lowercase g with my finger in the air over the slate, and he nodded once, gravely, the way his uncle nodded, and from that morning on he brought the slate to the bed every morning of his own accord. I learned in pieces the shape of Bow's life. He had married a girl named Susanna from down by the Yellowstone when he was 28, and they had built the cabin together, and she had died of consumption 6 winters past, and he had not put the cabin in mourning afterward, but had not added to it either. He ran a small herd of cattle in the upper pasture in summer, and in winter he ran a trap line north along the ridge, and he sold pelts twice a year in Cold Branch through Eldora Sweet at the dry goods. He read his Bible at the table on Sundays when the weather kept the Reverend's circuit closed. He spoke to his horse more than he spoke to most people, and his horse, for what it is worth, seemed to find the arrangement reasonable. He did not tell me any of this himself. Mrs. Carraway told me some. Asher told me some, in the matter-of-fact way of a child who does not know yet which parts of a life are private and which are not. The rest I gathered, the way one gathers small, smooth pebbles from a creek, by walking the bank carefully and bending often. Bow himself did not speak of his wife, or of his sister, or of his trapline, or of his Bible. When he spoke, it was about the weather, or the wood, or the broth, or whether the bay mare had favored her near foreleg that morning. He spoke without ornament and without grievance, and I came to understand, by the end of the first week, that this was not coldness. This was the shape of a man who had learned to use words sparingly because he had once used them on a person who was no longer there to hear them. On the 7th day after he had carried me through the door, the snow eased, and a man rode up the cut on a paint horse, and the man was Plenty Coups Walker, a Crow neighbor of Bow's from the eastern flank of the ridge. He was 47 that winter, with a long single braid of black hair laced with gray, and a calm face that did not change much whether he was speaking or listening. He had brought a quarter of dressed deer meat across his saddle, wrapped in clean canvas, and he set it inside the door without ceremony, and he and Bow stood at the threshold a moment and exchanged perhaps 5 sentences, and then Plenty Coups stepped into the room and looked at me where I sat now, propped against the headboard with Asher's slate across my lap. He looked at me a long, quiet moment, and then he nodded once. "She came back," he said, to Bow, and Bow said, "She came back," and that was all that was said about my fever. Plenty Coups stayed for coffee. He sat at the plank table with his hat in his lap and drank from a tin cup, and he asked Asher, in slow, careful English, how the boys' sums were faring, and Asher showed him a column of figures, and Plenty Coups made a small, approving sound. When he stood to leave, he laid 2 fingers briefly on the doorframe of the cabin, in a way that I understood, without being told, was a gesture of respect to the house. He nodded to me from the door. "You have come into a quiet country, ma'am," he said. "It is a good country to mend in." Then he was gone, and the sound of the paint horse's hooves went down the cut and was lost in the trees. It was a week after that, in the middle of March, that Reverend Solomon Pendleton rode up the cut himself. He came on a heavy roan gelding with a saddlebag full of papers and a small worn Bible tied to the horn with a leather thong. He had ridden 2 days from Cold Branch through snow that was no longer falling but had not yet melted, and his beard was hung with small icicles when he came through the door. Mrs. Carroway, who had stayed on now into a second week and showed no inclination to leave until the matter was settled, took his coat at the threshold and put a tin cup of hot coffee into his hand before he had finished stamping his boots. He sat by the fire a long, quiet moment with the coffee in his 2 hands before he spoke. Then he turned to me where I sat now in the rocking chair Bow had carried up from the loft for me, with a quilt across my knees, and he said, "Daughter, I have come to speak of the matter of your marriage." He said it gently, the way he said everything, and he glanced once at Bow, who was sitting at the plank table with his hands folded around his own cup, and Bow did not look up, but I saw the small movement of his shoulders that meant he was listening with his whole self, the way a man listens who knows that the next sentence is not his to speak. Reverend Pendleton drew the small folded paper out of his coat pocket. It was the same paper I saw with a small turn of my heart that he had pressed into my hand at the church door on the day of my wedding, and I understood for the first time that he had written down for me, before he had ever spoken the vows over me, the names and the sections of the territorial code that protected a woman in my situation. He had known. He had walked me to the door knowing, and he had pressed the paper against my ribs knowing, and he had kept the matter in his prayers from that day to this. I did not know whether to weep or to laugh, and so I did neither, but I felt my hand tighten on the arm of the rocking chair. "Under the law of this territory," the Reverend said, in his level circuit preacher voice, "a husband who removes his wife from a place of safety and abandons her in conditions endangering her life forfeits the bond of marriage by his own act. The desertion is its own dissolution. There is a procedure to make it formal in the records. I have spoken with the magistrate at Miles City by letter, and he is content to grant the dissolution on my testimony as the officiating minister, and on the testimony of the witnesses at the church, and the witness of the man who found you on the road. There will be no need for you to travel. There will be no need for you to face him in any room. The marriage will be set aside, and you will stand in the records as Hosanna Calloway, single woman, as you were before you stepped down from the train." I cannot tell you what I felt at those words. I had not known, until I heard them, how heavily the name Pickett had lain against my ribs all those weeks. I had not known that the small word marriage could be a stone in a pocket. I felt the stone go out of the pocket. I felt my breath go all the way down into my belly for the first time since the church door. I said, when I could speak, "Reverend, what must I do?" He said, "You must sign your name, daughter, where I will show you. That is all." He laid the paper on the small table between us, and he laid a steel pen beside it, and Bow, without looking up, slid the small ink bottle across the plank table to within the reach of the Reverend's hand. I signed my name, Hosanna Calloway. I signed it slowly because my hand was still not strong, and I signed it carefully because I did not want any letter of it to be unclear. The Reverend signed beneath me. "Mrs. Carroway," asked, signed as a witness in a clear schoolroom hand. Bow stood from the table when his turn came and signed last, in a hand that was small and square and patient. And as he set the pen down, he looked at me for the first time since the Reverend had begun to speak, and he did not smile, but he nodded once, the same single nod he had given me from the stool by the hearth on the day I woke. The nod said, "This thing is done." The nod said, "You are free." The nod said nothing about him, and asked nothing of me. I have thought since that I began to understand him in the moment of that nod. The Reverend stayed 2 days. He took meals at the plank table with us, and he prayed over the food in a voice that was neither loud nor mumbled. And on the second evening, he and Bow sat by the fire a long while, with very few words passing between them, the way two men sit who have known one another long enough not to need to fill the silence. Before he rode out on the third morning, Reverend Pendleton took my 2 hands in his at the cabin door, the way he had taken them in the church, and he said, "Daughter, I baptized this man's wife, and I buried her, and I baptized this boy, and I buried his mother, and I have known this man through all of it, and I will tell you only one thing about him, and then I will ride." He paused. "He does not lie, not by his mouth, and not by his deeds. Whatever he says to you, in whatever season, you may set your weight on it." Then he kissed my forehead, and he mounted the roan, and he was gone down the cut. The spring came slowly that year. It came the way spring comes in high country, by inches and by retreats, with 3 warm days followed by a fresh fall of snow, and then 5 warm days followed by a hard frost, and then a week of mud in which nothing moved easily, and everyone's boots were always wet. I gained back my strength in pieces. By the end of March, I could walk from the bed to the hearth without holding the wall. By the middle of April, I could carry a bucket of water from the spring to the cabin without resting. By the 1st of May, I could split kindling at the chopping block. Though Bow looked at me with his quiet gray eyes the first time he saw me with the hatchet, and seemed, very briefly, on the verge of saying something, and then said nothing, and went on splitting his own wood beside me. Mrs. Carraway rode home to her own ridge in the 2nd week of April, with a promise that she would come over every Saturday to see how I did, and bring me her preserves and take mine in trade. She kissed me on the forehead at the door, the way the Reverend had, and she said, "Child, this is a good house. I have known it through worse weather than yours. Do not be in a hurry to leave it, and do not be in a hurry to claim it. Both kinds of hurry make trouble. Go slow." Then she swung up onto her stout gray mule with surprising ease for a woman of 58, and she rode down the cut, and the cabin felt, that first afternoon without her, very quiet, in a way that made me notice for the first time that I was no longer afraid of quiet. I taught Asher his letters in the mornings at the plank table, and his sums after the noon meal, and his Bible verses on Sunday afternoons by the fire. He was a quick child when he was interested, and a slow child when he was not, and the trick of his learning was the trick of finding the picture in the problem. I learned to teach him a column of figures by counting the boards in the loft floor, and I learned to teach him a psalm by walking him along the verse the way a person walks along a fence. He took to me in the slow, careful way of a child who has lost his mother and his aunt, and is not in any hurry to attach his heart again. I did not press him. I let him come. In the afternoons I helped Mrs. Carraway when she rode over, and she taught me what she knew of preserving in that country, which was a great deal. We put up wild plums in July, she said, and wild raspberries in August, and chokecherries in September, and we rendered tallow in October, and we kept sourdough alive on the back of the stove all year, And there was a way of curing venison in salt and smoke that Bow had taught her after Susanna died, because Susanna had been the one in that house who had known how. She told me this last in a low voice over the kitchen table when Bow was out at the woodpile, and she added, "You should learn it from him yourself, child. He will teach you if you ask. He has not been asked in a long time." I asked him in late April. I sat on the chopping block one afternoon while he split rounds, and I said, "Mr. Whitestock, would you teach me how Susanna cured the venison?" He stopped his hatchet in mid-swing. He set the head of the hatchet down on the round and rested his hands on the helve and looked at me a long moment across the chips. Then he said, quietly, "She used a brine of 2 parts salt to 1 part brown sugar, and she hung the strips in the smokehouse 3 days over green alder, and she did not let the fire come up too hot. I will show you when we have a deer." That was all he said. He picked up the hatchet and went back to splitting. But after that day, when we had a deer, he showed me, and his hands moved through the work the way a man's hands move when he is using them to remember someone he loved. And I understood that the lesson he was giving me had cost him something, and I understood also that he had decided it was worth the cost. Plenty Coups Walker came once a fortnight that spring, and sometimes he stayed for the noon meal, and sometimes he only set a parcel inside the door and went on. He brought us deer in March and elk in early April, and a string of mountain trout in late April. And he never asked for anything in return, but Bow always sent something back with him, a tin of Mrs. Carraway's preserves, or a coil of sound rope, or once a small whetstone he had finished himself. I learned, by listening, that the friendship between the 2 men went back 20 years, to a season when Bow had been new to the ridge, and Plenty Coups had ridden up one afternoon and shown him, without speaking much English, where the springs ran in dry summers. The friendship had been built slowly, the way most things on that ridge had been built, and it did not require a great deal of conversation to keep it standing. The first time Bow looked at me in a way I noticed was on a morning in the last week of April. I had risen before dawn to bring in the milk pail from the spring house, and I had stopped at the cabin door to watch the sun come up over the eastern ridge. The light came up red along the rim and went gold across the snow that still lay in the high meadows, and the air smelled of melting snow and pine and something else, something green that had not been in the air a week before. I stood in the doorway with the pail in one hand and my shawl in the other, and I did not hear him come up behind me until he spoke. He said, "It will be early grass this year, Hosanna." I turned. He was standing 2 paces behind me with his hat in his hand, and he was not looking at the sunrise. He was looking at me. His gray eyes did not flicker. He said, "Forgive me," and he put his hat back on his head and went past me out into the yard and toward the barn, and he did not turn around again, and I stood in the doorway with the pail forgotten in my hand, and my heart doing a thing it had not done in a long time. I did not know what I felt that morning, and I did not allow myself to know, because the dissolution of my marriage was 3 weeks old that day, and Mrs. Carraway's words had sat in me carefully, and I was not in a hurry to be anything to anyone. But I noticed, after that morning, that I noticed him. I noticed the way he stood at the woodpile with his weight on his back foot. I noticed the way his hand went to the bay mare's shoulder before he set the saddle. I noticed the way he listened when Asher read aloud at the supper table, the way his head tilted very slightly to the left, the way a man listens to a fiddle tuning. I noticed that he did not, in any of those weeks, come within an arm's length of me when there was not a clear and practical reason to do so, and I noticed that this was not coldness either. It was care. It was the care of a man who had decided that the woman in his house was not going to be touched by another man's wanting, his own included, until she had stood up all the way on her own 2 feet. May came. The cottonwoods by the spring put out their small, sticky leaves, and the meadows below the cabin showed their first faint green, and the bay mare shed her winter coat in great handfuls when I curried her. Asher's reading was strong enough now that he read the morning chapter himself at breakfast, and his voice, which had been thin and uncertain in March, had filled into a clear, small bell of a voice that I could listen to for as long as he was willing to read. I had begun to keep a small kitchen garden against the south wall of the cabin, with peas and lettuce and a row of carrots, and I had begun, without quite admitting it to myself, to think of the cabin as a place rather than a stop. It was in the second week of May that Bow rode down to Cold Branch. He told me at breakfast that he had business at Eldora Sweets and would be gone 2 days, and he would bring up flour and salt and a tin of coffee and a new pair of boots for Asher, whose boots had given out at the toe in April. He said it in his ordinary voice, the way he had said many such things over the spring, and I nodded and asked whether he wanted me to put up a parcel of the smoked venison for him to carry. And he said yes, and that was all the conversation we had about the trip. He rode out at first light on the bay mare, and I watched him go down the cut from the doorway with my hands wrapped in my apron, and Asher stood beside me and waved once when his uncle turned at the bend, and Bow lifted his hand back to us once, and then he was gone. He came back on the evening of the second day. The bay mare came up the cut at her ordinary walking pace, and Bow swung down at the barn and unsaddled her and rubbed her down before he came to the cabin, the way he always did, and Asher and I had supper waiting on the plank table when he came in. He set a small canvas parcel by the door with his other parcels. He washed at the basin. He sat down to supper, and he said grace in his low, even voice, and he ate his stew and his bread, and he listened to Asher tell about the rabbit they had seen at the spring that afternoon, and he asked me about the carrots. It was, in every visible particular, an ordinary supper. But there was something in the set of his shoulders that I had not seen before, the way a man stands when he is holding something, and I understood, before the meal was over, that the something was in the small canvas parcel by the door. He helped Asher with the dishes, which was unusual because the dishes were ordinarily my work and the boys'. He set the boy to his evening sums at the table, which was ordinary. Then he picked up the small canvas parcel, and he came across the room, and he stopped at the corner of the plank table, and he set the parcel down on the wood between us, and he stood with his hat in his hands. I had risen from the rocker without quite meaning to. He did not kneel. I want to say that plainly, because in all the stories I had read as a girl, the man kneels, and I had thought, on the few stray occasions when I had let myself imagine such a moment, that the kneeling was the part that mattered. The kneeling was not the part that mattered. What mattered was that he stood with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes level on mine across the small distance of the kitchen table, and that his voice, when it came, was the same low, even voice that had told me to stay awake on the road north of Cold Branch. He said, "Miss Calloway, I rode down to Eldora's because she keeps a small case of rings under the counter that her brother sends up from Helena once a year. I picked one out. It is silver, with a piece of bone in the setting that a man up on the muscle shell carved a long time ago. It is not a fine ring. It is a plain one. He paused. He did not look away. He went on. I would not ask you to be anyone's wife again unless you wanted to be. I have seen what it costs a woman to be asked the wrong way, and I will not ask you that way. So I am not asking exactly. I am telling you that this ring is here. If you ever do want to be a wife again, and if you ever do think that a quiet man on a quiet ridge is the kind of husband you could stand, then this ring is yours, and I am yours along with it. If you do not, you are still under this roof for as long as you wish, and Asher's letters will still be your work if you wish them, and nothing about this evening will be spoken of again. I will not press you, Hosanna. I will not let you be pressed. I am going out to mind the mare. He set his hat on his head. He did not touch the parcel again. He turned and he walked out of the cabin, and the door shut behind him, gently, the way he shut all doors. I heard his boots cross the yard. I heard the barn door open. I heard the small, ordinary sounds a man makes when he is rubbing down a horse he has already rubbed down, because he needs the work of his hands more than the horse needs the rubbing. I sat down in the rocker. Asher, at the plank table, did not look up from his slate, but I saw the careful set of his shoulders, and I understood that the boy had heard every word and was, in his own small 10-year-old way, holding very still on my behalf. I sat in the rocker for a long time. I do not know how long. The fire moved in the hearth, and the kitchen lamp guttered once and steadied, and the small canvas parcel sat on the plank table where Bow had set it down. After a while I rose. I walked to the table. I unwrapped the canvas. The ring was as he had described it. The band was silver, hand-hammered, a little uneven in the way a thing is uneven when a man has made it with his hands rather than a machine. The setting was a small, flat oval of polished bone, white as fresh snow, and there was a tiny figure carved into the surface of the bone that I had to bring to the lamp to make out. It was a horse, a small, standing horse, with one ear forward and one back, the way a horse stands when it has decided to listen. I looked at it a long time. I felt my eyes go hot, and I felt my throat close. And I felt, for the first time in many years, the particular helpless tenderness of being seen by another person without being asked anything in exchange. I did not put the ring on my finger that night. I went to my small sewing basket by the fire, and I cut a length of soft brown leather cord, and I threaded the ring onto the cord, and I tied the cord around my neck under my collar, where my mother's tin locket had once hung. The ring sat against the hollow of my throat, light and warm against my skin, and I let it sit there. When Bow came back in from the barn an hour later, I was at the plank table again, with Asher's slate and a piece of new chalk, helping him work a sum he had got stuck on. Bow took off his hat and hung it on the peg, and he looked at the table where the canvas parcel had been, and the parcel was no longer there, and he looked at me, and his eyes went, very briefly, to the line of my collar and the small rise of the ring underneath, and he saw it. He did not smile. He did not look away. He nodded once, the same single nod he had given me from the stool by the hearth, and he said, "Good night, Asher. Good night, Hosanna." And he went to the settle by the fire and laid his folded gray blanket out, and he lay down with his hands folded on his chest, and he did not say another word. I sat at the table with the boy a long while after that, and the small horse on the bone setting pressed gently against the hollow of my throat with every breath I took. I wore the ring on the cord at my throat for 3 weeks. I did not speak of it, and Bow did not speak of it, and Asher, who saw it every morning at breakfast, did not speak of it either. Mrs. Carraway saw it the first Saturday she rode over, and she lifted one iron-gray eyebrow at me across her tin cup of tea, and I shook my head once, gently, and she nodded and did not raise the matter aloud. The ring rested where it rested. I went on with my mornings and my afternoons, and the spring went on with its becoming, and the meadows below the cabin grew greener by the week, and the wild plums came out in white cloud along the creek bottoms, and the air smelled, by the last week of May, of every kind of new green thing at once. I took the ring off the cord on the first morning of June. I had risen before dawn, the way I had risen the morning Bow had spoken to me at the doorway, and I had stood at the cabin door with my shawl around my shoulders to watch the sun come up over the eastern ridge. The light came up the same red along the rim and the same gold across the meadow, and the air had the same green new smell, and I thought, with a clarity that did not surprise me, that I did not want to stand at this door as anyone other than what I was about to be. I lifted the cord over my head. I untied the small knot. I slid the ring off the leather. I put it on the fourth finger of my left hand. It was a perfect fit. He had told Eldora Sweet, I learned later, to size it for the slimmer of the 2 narrow fingers I had laid on the plank table the night I had signed my name as single again, because he had been watching even then, and he had remembered. I did not rush to find him. I went about the morning's work, the milk pail, the hearth, the breakfast oats, and I let him come into the cabin in his own ordinary time. He came in with a fresh armload of split kindling for the stove. He set the kindling in the wood box. He turned. He saw my hand. He set his hat on the peg very slowly. He stood there a moment with his back to the door and his face to me, and his gray eyes did the closest thing to shining I had ever seen them do. And he said, in his low, even voice, "Hosanna." I said, "Yes." That was the conversation, the whole of it. Asher came down the loft ladder with his slate just then, and saw us standing across the room from one another, and stopped on the bottom rung, and looked from one of us to the other, and his small, careful smile came up and stayed. We were married on the 21st of June, the longest day of the year, in the high meadow above the cabin where the early grass had come, in thick and green. Reverend Solomon Pendleton rode up the cut on his roan with the same small worn Bible tied to the horn, and his white beard had been trimmed for the occasion, and his black coat had been brushed. Mrs. Carraway Holcomb rode over from the next ridge on her stout gray mule, with a basket of fresh bread and a jar of last summer's wild plum preserves. To plenty coos, Walker came up the eastern flank on his paint horse, with a folded length of red trade cloth across his saddle that he laid in my lap as a wedding gift without speaking, and that I have kept folded in my cedar chest from that day to this. Eldora Sweet had sent up a small tin of white sugar from the store for the wedding cake, with a note in her round schoolroom hand that said, simply, "I am glad, E." Asher Whitestock, scrubbed pink and wearing a clean shirt, carried the ring on a small embroidered cushion that Mrs. Carraway had made out of a piece of her own wedding linen. I wore my second-best dress, the same dress that had shown its corner pale against the snow at the 6th-mile marker on the night my first marriage ended. Mrs. Carraway had let down the hem and turned the cuffs and added a small collar of her own tatted lace at the throat. And the dress, which I had thought of for months as the dress that had been thrown into the snow, became, that morning, a dress that had survived. I have thought, since, that there are some garments and some women that the cold does not get to keep. We stood together in the high meadow with the eastern ridge behind us and the cabin smoke rising thin and white from the chimney down below. And Reverend Pendleton spoke the vows over us in his level circuit preacher voice. And this time, when I said I do, the steadiness in my voice was not the steadiness of a girl who had decided not to come apart. It was the steadiness of a woman who had stood up all the way on her own 2 feet and was choosing, of her own will, to stand alongside another. Bow said his vows in his low, even voice, and his gray eyes did not flicker, and when he slid the small silver and bone ring onto my finger for the 2nd time, and laid his rough, warm palm briefly over my hand to settle it there, I understood that I had been carried not 9 miles, but a much greater distance, and that the carrying had not been only that one night on the road north of Cold Branch. I have been Hosanna Whitestock now for many years. The cabin has grown a 2nd room and a 2nd hearth. Asher grew up tall and quiet and married a girl from Miles City and runs cattle on the upper pasture in his own name now. Mrs. Caraway Holcomb lived to 81 and is buried on her own ridge under a stone that we set ourselves. Plenty coos. Walker outlived us all in the way that mattered, in the memory we keep of him, and his sons and grandsons still ride up the cut at the change of every season. Reverend Solomon Pendleton baptized our 2 children before he laid down his circuit at last, and he is buried beside the church at Cold Branch under a stone Eldora sweet keeps clear of weeds. I have thought a great deal over these years about the man who left me at the 6th mile marker, and I have thought about him with less and less anger as the years have gone on. He did me the kindness, though he did not mean it as one, of removing himself from a life he was not equal to before he could spoil any more of it. I have thought also about the woman who stood beside her trunk in the snow and decided to walk. I owe her a great deal. She did not know it then, but the walking she did that night was the first walking of the rest of her life, and the road she walked has not, in all the years since, run out under her feet. But mostly, when I think back on that February, I think about a man on a stocky bay mare who came down a long ridge cut in a blizzard, on a horse that had thrown a stone, and who saw a shape against a pine tree and recognized in 3 seconds what the shape was, and who did not hesitate. I think about the bear fur cloak he wrapped around me before he had asked me a single question. I think about the 9 miles he walked beside the mare in snow up to her knees, and the once he spoke to tell me to stay awake, and the way his hand pressed me back into the saddle when I began to slide. I think about the door of his cabin opening into a room that smelled of pine smoke and stew, and a small boy stepping aside to let us in. I think about a folded gray blanket on the settle, and a stool by the hearth, and a name tried in a man's mouth like a word a man wants to be sure will hold weight. If you have walked any miles of your own in any storm at all, friend, and if you have ever wondered whether the next bend in your road might be the bend at which someone you have not yet met steps quietly into your life and changes the shape of it without asking anything of you in return, I will tell you this. There are quiet men in this world. There are quiet women. There are quiet houses on quiet ridges, with quiet stoves and quiet dogs and quiet kitchen tables on which a small canvas parcel may, one ordinary evening, be set down without ceremony. I have lived in such a house. I have sat at such a table. I have worn, for many years now, a small silver and bone ring with the figure of a horse carved into its setting, one ear forward and one back, the way a horse stands when it has decided to listen. If this story has found you in a hard season of your own, stay with us a little longer on the ridge. Sit by the fire, take the second cup. There is broth on the hob when you can take more. The road is long, and the snow has been deep, and the country into which you have stepped may not be the country you hoped for. But I will tell you, on the word of a girl who once stood beside her trunk in the dusk on the road north of Cold Branch, that there is more kindness in this world than the storm would have you believe. It walks sometimes beside a horse it will not ask to carry too much. It does not always announce itself. It does not always kneel, but it comes. It has come for me, and it may yet come for you. And when it does, friend, may you have the small, hard courage of the part of you that knows how to walk. I am Hosanna Whitestock of Whitestock Ridge, and that is the story of how I came to bear this name. Thank you for sitting with me by the fire a while. The kettle is still warm. Stay as long as you like.